Welcome to Myanmar Musings, a podcast of the Myanmar Research Centre at the Australian National University, Canberra. I'm Luke Corbin. It's April 11, 2021, and today we are speaking with Philip Jablon, creator of the Southeast Asia Movie Theatre Project, a written and photographic archive of still-standing movie theatres across the region. Hello, Philip.
Hello, Luke. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's wonderful to be in conversation with you again. I've had the pleasure of knowing Philip for a few years now. But before we met, I knew and read your blog, the Southeast Asia Movie Theatre Project, which I subscribed to more than a decade ago. Now, that blog sat in RSS readers at the time alongside other influential English language blogs about, initially, Thailand in particular, such as the Bangkok Bugle, Bangkok Pundit, Wise Quires Thai Film Journal, and New Mandala. So what a delight it was to be randomly introduced to you, Philip, one evening in Yangon several years ago. Now that I've brought up this blog, let's begin with that. The origin of your Southeast Asia Movie Theatre Project is in Thailand. So what is the project's history and how did you end up coming to work in Myanmar?
The project started in 2008, roughly. And it started by accident once. While I was studying for my master's degree at Chiang Mai University, I one day accidentally came across an old movie theater in Chiang Mai. I hadn't known about that theater prior to finding that, and it kind of tickled my fancy, and I decided that I wanted to go and watch a movie in it because old standalone movie theaters were not something that I knew about in Thailand, especially not in Chiang Mai. So I made up my mind that I'd go back and check out a film there. I waited about 3 or 4 months and talked to some friends about doing it. And by the time I got back, I discovered that it had been destroyed. So that became the beginning of this project that I did, which I called the Southeast Asia Movie Theatre Project. And the basic premise of the project has been to document as many, as you said, existing movie theaters, standalone movie theaters, that I can find in Southeast Asia. So how did I get to Myanmar? I guess that was the second part of your question. So after doing this work in Thailand for, I'd say, a year or so, and getting well acquainted with the practice of looking for old movie theaters and kind of honing my skills at photography and research, one day, while having drinks with a couple of friends in Chiang Mai, these were friends who were, I guess you would call, Burmese experts. And one of them said, hey, if you're interested in this project in Thailand, you should check out Burma, especially Yangon, because it's full of beautiful old standalone movie theaters that are still operating. And that was the beginning of that. I started doing research. I got a grant from a Thai foundation to go over to Myanmar and document old theaters. And that was in 2010. So that was the beginning of it.
Awesome. So how would you describe these theatres in Myanmar generally? Reading about the theatres you've surveyed, some terms come up again and again, like Art Deco and Brutalist. So for the unsure, what are the general trends in movie theatre architecture generally? What do these words mean? And, what's the vocabulary, the world that you're researching in?
It's a good question. Well, Art Deco and Brutalism are architectural styles that were very common, specifically Art Deco in Southeast Asia, in Myanmar in particular. While I'm not an architecture expert, from my basic understanding of the field, many of the structures that you find in Myanmar cities up and down the country, most of those built, let's say, between the 1940s and the early 1960s, have a tropical, what they call tropical Art Deco style to them. And tropical Art Deco is a little bit different from the standard Art Deco form in that it's usually a little bit toned down. It's slightly less ornate. It doesn't rely on the use of electric lighting techniques, which was a key component of standard Art Deco. I guess you would call it standard Art Deco. And it's the type of building you see in a lot of towns everywhere. This was a common architectural style in the middle decades of the 20th century in Myanmar, and movie theaters were no exception. Brutalism, on the other hand, I may be going out on a limb when I call some of the architecture I find in Myanmar brutalist. The underlying component of brutalist architecture is raw concrete. And in fact, I believe the term brutalism comes from, I believe the word brute, if I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but in French, brute means raw. So the sense is that these buildings look very sort of unfinished. They're somewhat hulking structures, very square. They're designed to look heavy and to evoke a sense of authority and power. And in the later decades of the 20th century, starting in the 70s and going into the 80s, I guess, some of the structures you find have more brutalist elements than they do Art Deco elements. So that's how I would, I guess that's why I use the term brutalist, even though I might not exactly be correct. But yeah.
All right. And sticking to architectural patterns, how else would you describe these movie theatres of Myanmar? Are there any unique features compared to other countries' cinematic legacies or architectural legacies still standing theatres? You used one term once or twice called Burmese Polychrome. What's that?
Burmese Polychrome. That's a style of movie theatre, an architectural style which I came across in my travels that I only found in Myanmar or Burma, whichever you want to call it. And so I decided to give it this name, Burmese Polychrome. It had a little ring to it. And the look of a Burmese Polychrome movie theater is a square facade accented with multicolored patterns in some sort of checkerboard fashion or another. The two most famous ones are right in the middle of Yangon on Sule Pagoda Road, the Naypyidaw and the Chaesong cinemas. They both have these kind of classic polychromatic facades. The multicolor or polychromatic look is achieved in most cases by just by paint, but sometimes it's done with tile. Sometimes it's done with various kinds of plaster or concrete moldings. But either way, I only saw these cinemas in Burma, so I decided to try and kind of give some identity to the cinema architecture in Myanmar. I gave it that name, hoping that real experts in architecture would accept it, and that people in Myanmar would then take ownership over it and say, oh, look, we have a very unique style. We have our own unique style of cinema architecture, which evolved from one thing or another here. And, it was kind of my attempt at getting people to preserve these buildings, as it's something that usually doesn't happen anywhere in the world. So it's very interesting comparing the theaters in Myanmar and Thailand. They both, I like to look at the theaters in terms of their national history, because they really tell the stories of each country. In Myanmar, economic development seems to have been somewhat greater in the early 20th and mid-20th century than it was in Thailand. And this is reflected in the fact that there are these large, what were at the time probably very expensive to build, standalone movie theaters in nearly every town. The look is indicative of the mid-century architecture, whether it be tropical Art Deco or some form of the international style. The brutalism I talked about earlier, that came a little bit later. And they were really widespread. Whereas in Thailand, you don't find too many theaters that were built before the 1960s. In Myanmar, most of what you find was built in the 40s and 50s, when there was this economic boom in the post-colonial years. Thailand was also going through a bit of a boom, but it was still more or less, particularly in the provinces, it was much less developed. Okay, then you have a very, very important year in the history of both countries, 1961. In 1962, that's when Burma goes under its first military dictatorship, the dictatorship of Ne Win. And slowly but surely, the economy starts to grind down as Ne Win and his junta nationalized the economy, movie theaters included. Also in 1961, and not exclusive of what happened in Myanmar, Thailand starts to boom. Thailand becomes the kind of favored country of the United States in its nation-building effort in the region. There are deals struck between the United States and Thailand to allow for American military bases, or to allow the American military to use Thai Air Force bases, which brings in millions and millions of dollars worth of investments, and Thailand starts to ramp up its development. So at the time when Myanmar is shutting down, Thailand is starting to develop. And you can see this clearly in the type and style and size and technology of the movie theaters in both countries. In Thailand at this point, you're starting to see movie theaters take on more brutalist, more modernist styles. They're equipping themselves with air conditioning, which prior to the 1960s was very much a luxury anywhere in Southeast Asia. They're installing new forms of projection technology like Cinerama. Meanwhile, in Myanmar, 1961-62, things are closing down. What's left are these old theaters, which were still largely built of wood, though they may have had a concrete or brick facade. Their interiors were largely wooden. So you see this dichotomy between the two countries that starts around that year. And both countries have a unique cinema architecture based on these developments.
And if we zoom in more to maybe some individual theatres, which cinemas in Myanmar would you say are the most significant for your research purposes, and then maybe, just your favourites as well?
There's a few very significant movie theaters in Myanmar. Most of it has to do with their architecture. So I should state before I go any further with this that I am not a Burmese speaker at all. So or reader. So my research is somewhat limited when I'm in Myanmar. Whereas in Thailand, I'm able to speak and read Thai. So I was able to do a lot more digging. Nonetheless, I would say that in Myanmar, there are a few theaters which stand out for some particular reasons. In the city of Mudong in Mon State, in 2017, I came across a theater which I believe is the oldest existing movie theater in the country. No, I don't think it's the oldest theater in the country. In fact, I'm sure it's not. But it is the oldest one that is still standing, at least to my or anybody else's knowledge. The theater dates to 1920. It was built in the style of kind of late British colonial architecture. It looks very much like the home of a wealthy person. Built very much in the same kind of style with all teak wood with a beautiful ornate portico. gabled front roof. To the naked eye, and if you can't read Burmese and weren't able to read the little signs at the top of it, you'd probably not know it was a movie theater. But lo and behold, it is. And it's old wooden theaters like that are extremely rare. They just, they were taken down largely, either replaced by more modern movie theaters or just taken down altogether and never replaced by any kind of movie theater. So this old colonial style movie theater in Mudon, dating to 1920, is a real treat for history buffs, architecture fans, and hopefully for preservationists too. I know that a few years ago, a well-known architect / architecture preservationist made it down to Mudon to document and sketch the movie theater. However, I don't know what's become of it since then. At the time I visited it in 2017, it was basically not doing much of anything. It was just owned by a local business person whose family had purchased it many years ago. So, but that's really a special place. A good reason for going to Mudon if you've never been. In the city of Mandalay, there's yet another beautiful, and quite active, although I don't know if it's active now. But prior to the pandemic, it was a very active movie theater called the Winlight Cinema. This was one of the finest mid-century movie theaters built in the country, dating to 1958. It's in the heart of downtown Mandalay. It's been extremely well maintained by its parent company, Mingala Cinemas, which is the largest theater chain in the country. Again, just a great mid-century movie theater. It's got what I would call streamlined modern architecture, which is kind of a cross between Art Deco and international style, I guess you can say. It's got elements of both. It's just a lovely building, and it's a great place to watch movies. And to this day, again, with the exception of the pandemic probably having it closed, it is the premier movie theater in Mandalay, especially for young folks. And I guess the other really important movie theater in the country would be the Thamada. The Thamada is the last true, I would say, operational movie palace in Southeast Asia. It was built, I believe, in 1960, right across from the central train station in Yangon. And it seems to embody the spirit of the times. Lovely mid-century architecture, a beautiful auditorium, bi-level auditorium, and just still very active. And for architecture lovers and cinema lovers and movie theater lovers, I would say definitely a place not to miss if you were to travel to Yangon. When I first started documenting movie theaters in Myanmar, particularly outside of the larger cities, the theaters that I would come across were complete time capsules. I mean, they were the seating was almost 100% old teak wooden seats, usually in bench form. Not something you think of as a very comfortable seating arrangement for watching a movie, but this was the traditional way that people watched movies in Myanmar. They never had air conditioning, aside from maybe some ceiling fans. They were almost all working on operational carbon arc projectors, which is a projection style or a form of projection that is gone in the vast majority of the world. It's basically a large sparkler is providing the light source. So whereas most cinemas in the West and most of Asia and all over are now digital. In Myanmar in 2012, 2011, they were still using carbon art projectors. So I really got to see the old era of the movie theater kind of in its last throes. By the time I came back in 2016, after a 4 or 5 year gap, a lot of those movie theaters, the old ones, had either gone out of business and were closed, or they had been completely renovated and modernized. So I feel very fortunate that I got to go initially when I did. Yeah, I saw something which really doesn't exist anymore.
So many movie theaters around the world are being destroyed and developed into other kinds of commercial buildings. Do you have any idea how many have been lost in Myanmar, and what is being done, if anything at all, to preserve and renovate the existing, still standing movie theatres? You mentioned that the Win Light had been renovated.
Myanmar is really interesting, Luke, I have to tell you. It's one of the only countries I know in the world, let alone Southeast Asia, in which over the last 5 years or so, there's been an uptick in the renovation of old movie houses. Why this is, I am not exactly sure. I don't know if it was some sort of government-initiated incentive program to renovate old cinemas, or if it was just multiple initiatives from the private sector to acquire movie theaters, and maybe the most economically efficient way to do so would be to simply take over an existing movie theater and modernize it. I don't know what the answer to that is, but it's happening. It's kind of mind-boggling from a movie theater preservation standpoint, because this just doesn't happen, particularly in countries that are going through periods of rapid economic development. Usually it's quite the other way around. The largest cinema operator in the company, Mingala Cinemas, I don't know if I would say they're spearheading this movement, but they are very active in acquiring old movie theaters around the country and updating them, modernizing them. They've done it in Pie, they've done it in Taunji, they have done it in, where else? Oh, in Yonglebin, a very small town in Bago region. They've done it in Bago. So yeah, it's fascinating. And then there's other companies, smaller cinema exhibition companies, which have done the same thing in other parts of the country. I think the one is called Mega Ace. They've been active in the upper central region, or the upper dry zone in like Koku and in Mandalay. And there's one or two other cinema chains that have been doing the same thing. So, strangely, Myanmar is in the very unique position of a country that is, I don't want to say across the board renovating its old movie theaters, but it's happening seemingly at a higher rate than happens in other countries. Certainly more so than in neighboring countries like India and Thailand, where they're being lost very quickly.
And reading through your project, it seems like there's this interstitial zone for many of these theatres. And in a country like where you are, the United States, a cinema will not stand dormant for long, generally speaking. If there's a decision to rebuild or to change, the cinema is bulldozed, there's a new building. In Myanmar, however, you came across quite a few standalone movie theatres that had been sort of transformed into warehouses, football pitch. So what's going on here? Does that speak to something about Myanmar's cinematic history or current economic situation?
That's a good question. It's a little bit, I guess I'd have to go on a case by case to answer that question. The one you're talking about that you mentioned, the football pitch, that's actually been renovated and turned back into a movie theater. That's the one in Yonglebin I believe Yonglebin, right? I think so. Let me look at the map.
It was the YMBA.
Yes. It was owned by the YMBA, and it was recently acquired by Mingala Cinemas, and they were renovating it. At least the last time I spoke to my contact at Mingala Cinemas. I should mention something that might put this into sharper focus. Apparently, and I've never read this myself, but I've been told this by people in the cinema industry in Myanmar, and that is that there is a law which stipulates that if a movie theater in Myanmar is closed and destroyed, it can only be replaced with a movie theater. So theoretically, all those old movie theaters that they tore down on Bojok Onsen Road in 2013 or so, whatever is built in their place must contain a cinema, at least according to the law. So that may have some bearing on why old movie theaters in Myanmar are currently going through a revival period rather than just being demolished and replaced. But again, this is where my expertise is limited. I don't know the exact answer to that.
Well, you just mentioned Bojok Onsen Road in Yangon. So this was a kind of cinema alley back in Rangoon. So could you tell us a little bit more about this part of the biggest city in Myanmar?
Sure. That was the greatest concentration of movie theaters anywhere in Southeast Asia. This strip of Bojok Onsen Road between Sule Pagoda, basically, actually, even further west of Sule Pagoda, maybe to about 36th Street or so, going all the way down to Pansodan Road. At its peak, there were 7, maybe 8 movie theaters just on that road. And then on the intersecting roads, like Sule Pagoda, there were more theaters. The Naypyidaw and the Shea Song are still in existence. Right across the street where the Traders Hotel is, I guess it's the Traders Hotel, and that new big shopping center that they built. There were 2 other theaters there, the Papa Win and the Globe. I believe the Papa Win's original name was the Palladium. So bottom line is this little quarter of Yangon had the highest concentration of movie theaters anywhere in Southeast Asia. People have asked me why this is, and I have a theory which is basically that movie theaters developed in large numbers in proximity to transportation centers. And the train station is sort of right across, in a way, it's right across the street from where these theaters are. So when the theaters were built starting in the 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s, train travel was still the most common form of long distance travel for the most part, if you're in Yangon. So people would come to Yangon from neighboring villages and towns to catch the train to go somewhere further up country. They'd get there hours beforehand, and you've got time to kill. So what better place to kill time than in a movie theater? And in the early years of movie theaters, movies weren't necessarily on fixed schedules. It was more like a rotational program. You'd see newsreels, and you'd see cartoons, and then you'd see a movie, and then you'd see more newsreels. So there was something that people could more or less move in and out of kind of freely. Not unlike more modern times where, we go to the movies at a fixed time and we stay till the end and then we leave. So that's my theory. You can see the same in New York, around the old train stations there. In Philadelphia, the largest concentration of movie theaters was near the Broad Street station of the Pennsylvania Railroad. You had a half dozen movie theaters right across the street. There's another section in Philadelphia, another major train station belonged to the Reading Railroad. Right across the street from there, there's another 2 or 3 theaters. So I've never seen this written anywhere, and I haven't done any deep research into it, but it seems to make sense. I've also, in other places around the world, I've found movie theaters coupled with bus stations, which, there's kind of a similar social patterns going on. People coming from afar, they have time to kill, so why not go to the movie theater? So that's how I would chalk up Cinema Row in Yangon.
Very cool. And now you've sort of mentioned a flippant, just why not go to the movie theater? I want to ask you about the opposite. So is it purely the architecture or, the regional history that drew you to movie theaters in particular? Or is it also their social lives? Is there something special about what goes on inside a cinema, something emotional, cathartic? Do you think cinemas even could signify something about the 20th century, which was the century of so much, but it was really definitively the century of cinema? So what are the romantic motivations behind this project, this passion project of yours, Philip?
Right. Great question, Luke. And the answer is twofold. On the one hand, yes, there is nothing like going to see a movie in a movie theater, bar none. And I can guarantee that I've been watching hundreds of movies at home on my couch during this pandemic. And although I've enjoyed many of them, many more of them, I would say, I would have enjoyed that way more had I seen that in the movie theater, both new and old movies. There is definitely something to seeing the movie on a big screen in a darkened room with or without other people around, that elevates the practice above doing it in the privacy of your own home. But I would say even more than that, and I'm a big cinema buff, but even more than that, I am interested in the structure of cities that made old standalone movie theaters, or what are now old standalone movie theaters, viable, the context in which they came about. And by and large, that's generally cities which were dense. They were pedestrian-oriented or transit-oriented, public transit, that is. They were low-rise. They were very human scale. That's the essence of it. In society after society around the world, where you find old movie theaters are no longer in existence or not viable, you also find societies which are very dependent on private automobile ownership. And as societies developed around the automobile, and vice versa, as people modified their lives based on the automobile, places like standalone movie theaters, which are tended to be in dense commercial areas of cities and contained a couple thousand seats, they started to lose their economic viability. If people are now in contemporary societies owning cars and living in car-centric spaces like suburban areas or exurbs, and they're driving everywhere, it's difficult to go and find a parking spot in the middle of a downtown that's where everybody else is driving, to go to a movie theater that's crammed in between a bunch of other buildings. So for me, to see these old movie theaters alive, which they have been since I've been documenting them in Burma, is really like a glimpse into a kind of pre-car society. Now that's obviously changed a lot over the course of time that I've been doing this work in Myanmar. In 2010 when I started, if you were in some, third tier city up country, like let's say, Mitila or Pie, there were generally very few private automobiles. and towns are still, people have motorbikes, but there's still people on the street. There's foot traffic everywhere. That's changed a lot over the last 10 years, especially in Yangon, Mandalay, and some of the bigger cities. And you begin to see these kind of artifacts of early 20th century life start to disappear because of that. As cities begin to modify themselves to make room for car-centric lifestyles. I mean, the clearest indication of that in Yangon would be the diminishing sidewalks. Yangon sidewalks used to be huge, and not only were they huge, but they were filled with all kinds of business activity. Small peddlers of every stripe made livings on the streets of Yangon, at least in the downtown area. And to some extent they still do, but they've lost a lot of space when the city decided to cut back the size of its sidewalks to create parking spaces. It changes the whole ebb and flow of city life. I guess I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, it did. And there's no question that, driving and parking in downtown Yangon is no longer sustainable and an exercise in severe frustration. Speaking of severe frustration, it would be remiss of me not to ask you about what your biggest challenges were in carrying out this project and documenting movie theatres in Myanmar, which is not always a simple place to navigate.
The most difficult challenges I've faced, I would say, when I first started, getting to smaller towns was very difficult. I shouldn't say getting there. I could get there. But being able to stay long enough to track down the old movie theater and take a picture of it was very difficult. In 2010, 2011, especially in the dry zone cities, which I visited, I was often greeted by local authorities or informal, informant types who were trying to get me to leave the city for one reason or another. When a foreigner entered certain towns, they had to register, and this meant going through a whole lot of paperwork for local authorities. And local authorities often didn't want to go through the hassle of doing that, so they would just say, please leave, get on the next train or take a motorbike to the next town. And then I'd arrive in the next town and they'd say, please leave, we have no accommodation for you. You have to get out. In a few places we ran into, these informants who would come up to you and say, what is your name? Give me your name. And where do you live? Where are you from? So that was one big impediment to doing the work. The other one is my lack of Burmese. But since 2016, I went in 2010, 2011. That's when I would experience the authorities chasing me out of places. But after that, I didn't come back to Myanmar until 2016, and the ability to travel and the way I was greeted and treated was much different going forward. I basically had no problems anywhere save for a few regions that were controlled by various ethnic armies.
So now we know what the Southeast Asian Movie Theatre Project is, but people might be wondering what they can do, how they can engage. So what kind of memorabilia have you collected? I know that you sell some items and you've produced some video and photographic, artworks that you've put together under the auspices of the project. So tell us all about that.
That's right, Luke. Well, in 2019, my first book was published. It's entitled Thailand's Movie Theaters, Relics, Ruins, and the Romance of Escape. And it is basically a best of my travel and photography in Thailand. It is published by River Books, and it is available at all good online booksellers, or through me. I have copies. I believe it's it is out of print now, and I believe there aren't many copies left with my publisher. It only had a very limited print run. So if you're not able to find it online, feel free to reach out to me. The project got started with a blog, and the blog is called the Southeast Asia Movie Theater Project, and that is where I deposit all my photographs and accompanying text about my travels and research into movie theaters in the region. I've really only covered Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar, but all three I've covered fairly extensively, so you can really get lost in that website. Sadly, I don't update it as much as I used to. It's down to a scant few times a year these days, but I still have a lot of material that needs to be written up and posted. So, it's if you ever want to go down a rabbit hole, that's a good place, and eventually there'll be new content. You mentioned I've done a few short films. Again, I haven't been very active in that. I've got one in production now that once the COVID restrictions end, I'll hopefully get back with my editor and finish doing that. But I do have a YouTube channel also called the Southeast Asia Movie Theater Project, where you can see my few short videos, which are mostly little travel docs and kind of cinema verite from a few places around the region. And I make T-shirts on occasion. I collect memorabilia like old movie theater tickets. And I take the logos from those old movie theater tickets, and I've made T-shirts out of them. Most recently, I've been selling off a T-shirt that I have, which has the logo of the Shui Hintha Cinema in Bago. And I've been using the proceeds from that I've been donating the proceeds from that, 100% of the proceeds, to various organizations that are supporting the CDM in Myanmar. So if you'd like a movie theater ticket T-shirt, feel free to reach out again, and I can do that, and your money will be going to a good and somewhat sad cause.
Indeed. You've already mentioned quite a few, but are there any other initiatives that are going on under the project at the moment that we can look forward to?
Well, I have started writing the introduction to a book on Myanmar movie theaters, which I hope to publish someday. It's in the very early stages. I've compiled most of my photography, and I was making some progress with that until the coup happened. I was writing the introduction to the book and basically describing what it was like to travel in Myanmar before the political reforms of the early 2010s, and comparing that to what it was like afterwards. And then the coup happened, so I decided that I better put that on hold and wait to see what goes down, so I'm not writing things which are outdated before they're even published. But nonetheless, that is very high on my list of priorities, and I am now, in lieu of that, the stoppage of the Burmese movie theater book, for the Myanmar movie theater book, I am co-authoring a book on Thai movie posters, which is also in its seminal phase, but I do have a publisher lined up and should hopefully be out by the end of the year.
Very cool. And I've seen a lot of these posters, these unique Thai movie posters that often were hand painted and would do interesting interpretations of foreign movies, American movies, in a sort of Thai vernacular, hand painted. They're so cool.
Yes, they're very, very unique forms of advertisement. Very unique to Thailand, actually.
Yeah, now you've already mentioned a few cinemas, but before we conclude this podcast, I always like to ask guests to give a recommendation for something to do with Myanmar. So it can be another cinema, or it can just be something cinematic, or it can be anything at all. Do you have a recommendation for our listeners?
Let me give two, if that's okay. Or maybe three. Maybe three. I'll make them quick. If you're in Yangon, definitely go see a movie at the Thamada Cinema. It's probably going to be a Myanmar movie. The quality of it might not be that great, but it's worth it to see a film in that theater just for the experience of it. A beautiful cinema. If you have the chance, also go visit another theater I mentioned earlier, the Aung Mingala Cinema in Mudong. That is the oldest existing movie theater in the country. It makes for a great excuse to go visit this little visited town in Mon State, and it's just a fascinating old structure that you're unlikely to see anywhere else. It'll make for a very unique travel destination. And lastly, I would say, if it's possible, you might have to get a travel permit, and it might be a little bit pricey to do, but a trip to Mogok in northeastern Mandalay is a very worthwhile trip. Besides the city being just a stunning upland Southeast Asian city, it has an old movie theater which has recently been renovated, which is probably in one of the most dramatic settings any movie theater you'll find anywhere on Earth. It's right up against a steep, verdant mountain. I would highly recommend Mogok.
Those are three excellent recommendations. Thank you so much for those. It's so cool to have you on, Philip. Like I said, I was reading your blog more than a decade ago. You were one of the, fires that fueled my interest in Southeast Asia because I came from a cinema studies background, and I'm really, really happy to be able to have this conversation with you on Myanmar musings. So thank you so much for coming on and for your recommendations and for sharing all about the Southeast Asia Movie Theatre project.
Luke, it's been a pleasure, and I thank you. And I did not know that you came from a cinema studies background. That's news to me. That explains a lot, though.
There you go. Thanks again, Philip, and catch you next time.
Yep. Thank you, Luke. Take care.